Good evening. This is Mae Brussell for KAZU-FM, Pacific Grove, California. It is broadcast number 580, December the 17th, 1983. When Pope John Paul II was shot in May 1981, just 2 months after Ronald Reagan was shot in the United States, I did a several-part broadcast, part 1 and 2, on the shooting of John Paul, and then updated information during the year since 1981. I'm going to continue where I left off on the shooting of the Pope, marking this broadcast John Paul III, because for the next 2 or 3 weeks I'm going into the relationship of the shooting of John Paul II, the attempted murder or the propaganda that accompanied the attempted murder, to various events that are taking place that I have discussed through the years on this program, and point out the parallels and the names of people involved that have played a big role in other murder assassinations and their interlocking connections. Now, when the Pope was shot on the broadcast May 17th, 1981, that was program number 493. We're up to 580 now. I asked the question, why would anybody want to shoot John Paul II? What are the motives? And as you know, the major news medias are the accepted sources of information through television and radio and newspaper. Don't very often ask the question. They began looking into the background of Agca, the man who shot the Pope and was taken right away to the jail. But I tried to analyze who would attempt to shoot the head of the Catholic Church at that particular time, and for what reasons. And I listed 5 motives, and you can see how close I was to that a year and a half ago, 1 week after the attempt on the life of the Pope. It was less than a week. It was just the same few days within the week. Number 1, would it be Muslim versus the Christian war? Would the Muslims, because of certain positions the Vatican was taking, send a man like Agca, who right away was identified as training in Lebanon PLO camps and with the radical terrorists and in hiding out after he escaped from Turkey? Would they, the PLO, have him shoot the Pope? The answer was a categorical no. I doubt that seriously. The Pope recognized the PLO in the Middle East. He has never acknowledged the existence of Israel to this day. You saw him recently with a picture of Arafat entertained at the Vatican. The PLO and the IRA and the Pope are all on the same side. So there would be no reason for the PLO or the Lebanese terrorists, unless it would be the Falange Christian terrorists who had a reason to cooperate in training Agca, just as he belonged to the right wing in Turkey. The second question, would it be the far, far right, more fascist than most military governments today, referring to organizations like the Masonic Lodge that surfaced at the same week the Pope was shot, the P2 secret organization, the links going back to Mussolini and Hitler and Franco, and the network of Scorzeni Odessa? Would it be the far right who want no interference with a possible bloodbath in Central America? Now, a year ago, I said, it was 81, I said that we will have a bloodbath in El Salvador, Honduras, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. And did they want a certainty that a pope who was more along with the lines that would accept this bloodbath, as the Pope Pacelli accepted the bloodbath in Spain and Guernica and the concentration camps in Poland and Yugoslavia and the Ustashi, and I don't have to list it all for you. Did they want somebody who would come in and cover their bases farther? And it seems now that this Pope is expressing, as I mentioned last week, that atomic bombs are evil, and the genetic banks, the sperm banks, the Nobel banks are like Nazi Germany. So maybe, even though he's a far-right Pope, he gave some inklings that, given the position of Pope, he could alter his views once he was in office. And did they want to make sure by May 81 that he would not interfere with the process of wiping out to a feudal state the bloodbath in Central America, which is in fact taking place today? The United States government just raised the money for weapons to Guatemala, and they're very nicely committing genocide, as our other allies over there in American-trained soldiers. The third possible motive was the Protestant versus Catholic, the power of the Pope. That's the Carl McIntyre group from Texas and Florida and the Sun Belt, who have a dislike of the popularity of John Paul II and the traditional Protestant versus Catholic conflict. John Hinckley Jr. and Mr. Richardson, another fellow that was arrested that was following Jodie Foster and was linked to John Hinckley, were part of that McIntyre group. They worked with Nazis in this country that were not necessarily Catholic, that were Protestant. But the third reason there, I said, I doubt that. If they shot one pope, they would get another one. It wouldn't be that easy, and the policies wouldn't be any different. So the Protestants aren't about to shoot a pope any more than the PLO, who works with the PLO. Now, the fourth motive was interference with Turkish politics. They had a coup in 1980 that is far right now, but the United States and the NATO countries that work closely with the Italian government and with the Vatican put down the growing of poppies, along with Michael Sindona and Richard Nixon. This was part of their policy. The Vatican links to NATO, and Ronald Reagan and Alexander Haig, and Licio Gelli was at Reagan's inauguration just 5 months earlier. They are trying to direct the Turkey politics and divide the Turks against the Muslims. That's part of their crusade. And there could have been a reason why the far-right Turkish people don't want the Vatican interfering and breaking up the Muslim relationships. And point 4 of this, I said this economic factor is strong when you link it to number 5, which is the narcotic war. Now, Pat Roberts of the 700 Club was doing his usual television this week, and a long subscriber to World Watchers told me that he has flown over to Lebanon to meet with Mr. Jamal for the purpose of setting up antennas and radios, and that he wants to turn the whole world Christian and wipe out the Muslim religion. And he's over there working with the Christian Phalange in Lebanon. Now, Mr. Roberts worked for J. Peter Grace of Peru, and J. Peter Grace and the Grace family are higher echelon of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta that was just recognized as a separate entity by Rome this past week, elevated like the Opus Dei. So J. Peter Grace is a high Catholic representative of the Vatican, of the notorious Opus Dei, the lay group that I keep saying wants to take us back to the Inquisition because the Reformation brings liberals such as the anti-atomic bomb bishops and so forth, or even communism. So J. Peter Grace worked for Pat Roberts, or still could, or get his money. I think these radio Christian shows are funded by this Nazi money that is salted away. And he's over there with the Christian Phalange trying to arrange ways to do away with the Muslims. So that, in fact, a year and a half later supports what I figured out was a possible reason for Agca being used to wipe out the Pope at that time and getting somebody not so hard on the Muslims, breaking them up. The fifth reason was the narcotic war. And of course, this was a year and a half ago that I was earmarking this, and I have files here to share, and I'm sure you're reading them, of the arrest in Milan and the links to London and links to the organizations in Bulgaria and in Turkey that pour heroin and narcotics into Germany and into the United States and into Europe, but use those eastern countries. Now, the narcotic war goes like this. Richard Nixon, as the President of the United States, worked closely with the Shah of Iran and Alexander Haig and the old Watergate team. And what they did, they tied off the Turkish heroin and made the farmer poor. And what they did, they didn't stop heroin in this traffic, but they directed the heroin to a different area. And what they did, they didn't want the Turks to be rich with the money. They moved it to Iran so that the Southeast Asian heroin and narcotics, opium, coming out of Indochina and Indonesia would go up to Saigon and into Marseille and into Europe, where the opium was filtered and made into blocks and then shipped to the United States and all over America, all over the world. But in America, we're hit hard. Every city is practically owned by the mob and mob control. And Agca grew up in the area of a farmer, where all the farmers were poor because of the decisions of the Vatican working. Michael Sindona and the Vatican was common knowledge by the time that Agca was used for this assassination attempt, was directly linked to the Nixon administration, later the Reagan administration, and the want to grow their own poppies, because what we did, we made Shah and the Shah family rich and directed the flow to the people we wanted to have the money, who would put it in the Chase Manhattan Bank, and then there's politics and heroin, and so one group is cut off. Now, we're doing this at the present time, the Ronald Reagan administration, the parallel where he acts like in Fort Lauderdale, the Colombian cocaine is the biggest thing going in the world. But he's allowing the Japanese mafia, through marriages with Reverend Moon, I understand they're pouring into these ridiculous, they're not marriages at all, but the Japanese mafia and the Hong Kong mafia are buying up this country, coming in from that end. So Ronald Reagan's administration, with Attorney General William French Smith and Paul Laxalt, is not anti-drug. It's where do you bring it in to make the most profits, and who do you cut off so that those farmers don't have it. Now, those were the motives that I listed in May 1981, and felt that it had more to do with the Turkish politics with NATO and Reagan and Haig, with the far right, and also possibly wanting a pope that they would be assured would not speak up when the bloodbaths came. And then the next week, May 24th, 1981, on broadcast 494, I talked about the police looking into a second gun in Rome. 2 men were arrested. One was involved, part of a Rome right-wing group. This was written in the night news service in May of 81. A mysterious break from poverty and isolation Agca had to a technical school in Ankara in Turkey. Thousands were recruited by extremist groups, neo-Nazi groups in the early 60s. 2,000 right-wing extremists escaped from prison. He belonged to the Grey Wolves organization, a bloody terror pact called a League of Idealist Youth, the UGD. This pact was founded by the Central Intelligence Agency with their manuals in 1969, and the plans were to regain the Ottoman Empire lost in World War I, the territory in the Middle East, and this would go again into the Pat Roberts radio station towers and working with Jamal and the Christians, setting a base in the Middle East. Those were subjects that I brought up a year and a half ago. Now the news stories are trying to swing to the belief that a Bulgarian KGB conspiracy was behind the shooting of the Pope. The newspapers are filled with stories accusing the Bulgarian communists of being behind the Pope, and I'll cite some of those articles with you and take you through them in a chronological order so that you can understand, and then going on to the narcotics connections and the arms smuggling and the real role that Agca had with the people that he worked with, exposed in 1981. Why at this time are they pulling out a KGB story and trying to make it wash? I briefly mentioned it last week. Now the script goes like this over in the Middle East. Ever since 1970, the Vatican, as exposed in a book, The Vatican Connections, just this year, Paul Marcinkus, the man who wasn't made the cardinal last week, John Connally, part of the CIA foundations in Houston, Texas, and the United States were involved in counterfeit, $1 billion stock counterfeit to put money into the Vatican. Michael Sindona was arrested along with David Kennedy, chairman of Continental Illinois Bank. And they worked together, and Richard Nixon, as I mentioned last week, was the attorney for Michael Sindona. Now, when Sindona was arrested for bank failure here, he fled to Italy. He pretended he was kidnapped, and they asked him to leave the country while the Pope visited the United States. The Pope was coming here for his great photographic, remember the visit with all the clouds and the capes and kissing the ground and the masses of people, carefully staged visit. The trip was arranged by Licio Gelli, who fled the country and is now arrested in Switzerland, and Italy is afraid to bring him back. When Sindona fled there, that trip, and not only was Licio Gelli arranging it, but Carlo Gambino family, the organized crime fascist group that have strong links in the United States. And then Sindona came home and went to jail, where he's serving time in jail. That's God's banker. But starting in 1979, this is 2 years before the Pope was shot, There were investigations in New York City, tape recordings and studies around the world about missing money in the Vatican, and everywhere they investigated the crime investigation, it was leading to Rome and to the Vatican. So by May 13th, 1981, at the time the Pope was shot, the Vatican Bank was being drawn into connections to the mob, to the Bahamas banks, to offshore banking, to Panamanian investments, and may have been that as he realized, the Polish Pope, what he was being swept into with Paul Marcinkus, they had or tried to kill him and used a member of the mafia whose money and sources of funds comes from those offshore bankings. So, but the Pope survived, and a day later, Agca said, within a year, if they don't rescue me, they plan to rescue me, I'll be out. Within a year, I'll talk if I can get a lighter sentence. And they promised him a lighter sentence. So what he's done in a year is change it from what he said a year ago to a KGB Bulgarian story, and they nicely arranged that he did meet Bulgarians. He never knew their name or anything about them. So the Nixon-Sedona connections had tied up the Turkish heroin traffic. It left the profits to go to other countries in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, the French connection, the Korean connection. And the time that the assassination attempt took place, it would in fact be a reason to want the Pope shot because of the Vatican links to the mob and the mafia. That it's not so strange when Roberto Calvi is about to tell about the Vatican money and the offshore banking, and he's the banker for the Vatican, and he's hung in London in June 18th this year, just when he's about to testify. So you can shoot Roberto Calvi or Mr. John Rosselli or Sam Giancana, and primary witnesses that I talk about all the time, Kevin McCullough with the Edwin Wilson case, primary witnesses are offed all the time, so why wouldn't the Pope be offed? Now, I mentioned last week briefly the article, and I want to just refer to it again because it has a continuity to the rest of the next few weeks' broadcast. The one by Alexander Cockburn, I won't give him the other name this time, I did it last week, November 30th, 1982, in the Village Voice. There were a lot of articles on the death of Grace Kelly. It is right to question Grace Kelly's death. The car was immediately taken away with a tarp and covered over. She wasn't given a brain scan. Her family was told not to come. It wasn't serious, and she was in a deep coma. She didn't have the body examined by outside people who are taken to a hospital that treats these kinds of things. A witness was there at the time and then drove away. There were a lot of questions about Grace, and they were written up in the National Enquirer and into various newspapers, the Star and the Globe. And when Charles Cockburn was reading Cliff Leindecker's story, which he admitted had a wealth of interesting circumstantial detail, when he noticed that Mae Brussell wrote it, our old friend, an assassination buff, at that point he said he put it down. He was pleased I was working on Grace, but he didn't want to read any more. Now, this comment is so typical of people who are doing excellent work but won't pull their energies, and this is a problem. I don't know whether it's machoism, where a woman isn't supposed to figure this out, whether she beat you to the story, where you don't take seriously these things until after they happen and analyze them. But I don't understand what his thinking is. I called him in New York and spoke with him, and he apologized. He said, I did take a little snap at you or swipe at you. I said, well, why do you do it? You've done it before. What is that you're doing? You know, he wrote a remark about Up the Maypole when I was on WBAI with New York for 3 years with this same program. And what took me off the program was not making fun of Nixon and Watergate. That was fair play. But when I linked it to Reinhard Gehlen and Hitler's chief of intelligence and Himmler and Bormann and Mengele and the Nazis that came into this country, and that was 1976. That was 6 years before John Loftus even whispered it on 60 Minutes. They took it off the air. We couldn't make the Nazi connections and let the people in New York figure it out for themselves. I can do it out here in California and other stations, but he was instrumental in writing in The Voice, Up the Maypole, how can you have May on WBAI? And so I called him and talked with him and said, I'm going to come see you. He said, you're not coming to New York all the way to see me. I said, I'm going to come see you, and I want to understand why you have the necessity. The Village Voice has had magnificent articles on Menachem Begin and the brown shirts and training with Mussolini. and working in the Polish Nazi regime. I never would have had it from any other source. He's done wonderful articles on the Nugan handbag, a wonderful one long article, and wonderful story on the background of Albert Einstein warning the Israeli people, the Palestinians and the Israelis, don't ever let a man like Menachem Begin work his way up in the government. So I pulled out just one article to copy to send to Cockburn. It's from the Los Angeles Times, May 31st. The Masons have everything else. Why not topple the Italian government? And it's how the Masonic Lodge, that secret P2, is written by George Armstrong. Many of you remember it. It's off of Rome, Italy's colossal new cast of 1,000. Scandal. The P2 Masonic Lodge leaves many here with ambivalent feelings. There's never been a similar scandal in the world. The Italian reaction to the scandal has people with a long Roman Catholic tradition and a long tradition of anti-clericalism trying to size up in a nutshell. It's big enough to contain a synopsis of the P2 scandal. Here are the essentials. The Grand Orient Masonic Lodge, a very particular lodge called Propaganda 2, was set up and placed in the hands of Licio Gelli. No regular meetings, no one ever met. Cream of the Italian establishment, industrialists, generals, opinion makers of the media. The venerable master reaches them by phone or letter. He's been charged with criminal association, espionage, industrial secrets, files on 30,000 people in public life. He's been running this for 15 years. Gelli's background includes fighting with the Nazis against Italian resistance, engineering boats, with people that were Nazis, the return of Juan Perón to Argentina. He commutes between Monte Carlo and Switzerland. The police raided his villa last March and got the list of his members, 953, many of them from NATO, and Alexander Haig was the head of NATO. Italian admiral, generals, civilian coordinators of the Secret Service. Licio Gelli was the head of this. It was a first attempt since Greece to put a Nazi, Mussolini, Hitler government into power, and they've been working since 1947 with the Central Intelligence Agency. And Licio Gelli, when he fled Italy, he lived in Monte Carlo. Now, when I was working on the story of Grace Kelly and the Propaganda Do and the Masonic Lodge and the Masonic Lodge in Monte Carlo of Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger being members, there was a lot of reason to know that what was going on in the Vatican included a whole list of 8 or 10 deaths at the time when Grace Kelly was in there allegedly for the purpose of making that simpy movie I saw at Christmas time. We'll get another one at Easter. But she traveled back and forth in Rome at the time that these scandals were going on in this summer, just weeks after Licio Gelli was murdered, and the Vatican Monte Carlo money was tied up and lost. The lodges are going broke, and her husband's desperate. Grace Kelly worked with all of these people from the Opus Dei, and is Opus Dei, represents the monarchy and the lay Catholics who arranged her marriage. And I bring this at length because there is no reason at all for Cockburn or the Village Voice to be so smug about it. And it's really a tragedy because you can expect it by some people, but there are others that I would wish that they would be a little more inquisitive when they go out attacking people doing research like myself or other people. But putting that aside, Alexander Cockburn came out with this story. I mentioned before, if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope, I'll copy and send it to you if you don't have it from the Village Voice. This is January the 4th, 1983, and I usually, before I go on a program, if you ever noticed, I'll spend 3 or 4 hours on one article outlining it, and I go down the points. It may look casual, and I don't read a script. Many articles, I'll spend 3 or 4 hours doing just that to share with you and paraphrase it so that it isn't just read on the air. But this particular article, once in a blue moon, an article comes out that makes a new breakthrough, and I'm going to take it and read it with you and analyze it with you if it takes the remainder of the hour, because it is so essential to the whole era. It's called The Pope, Lumumba, and the Calvi Connections, and it's a brilliant article. Insiders and intelligence experts, according to Cockburn, are talking on 7 continents, and you better believe one of them is Antarctica, to what they call the Calb, the K-A-L-B connections. This is a tangled one. The Calbs are Madeline Calb, who's married to Marvin Calb, and Marvin and Bernard Calb are brothers. The Calb connection. This is a tangled story from the jungles of Congo to the expensive world of TV network TV, that rotten stuff, to the corridors of the Vatican itself, from the Congo to the news media, that electric eye, the NBC and the CBS that you watch so well, and ABC. This particular story is about NBC and ABC and CBS. We can take on ABC later. The story starts in early 1961. That's 2 years before John Kennedy was murdered, and he was just in office and took oath, when the African nationalist Patrice Lumumba, the first premier of the Congo, was murdered. Lumumba was delivered, bound hand and foot, to his most deathly foe, Mr. Chambe, Belgian pawn and leader of the secessionist movement in the province of Katanga. The copper there is rich, Congolese money, and they had to arrange the murder of Chambe. The trail is tangled. It stretches from their bars to the closed doors of the CIA in Langley, Virginia. Keep in mind, this is an article about the propaganda on the shooting of the Pope. That's what we're going to, the Pope, Lumumba, and Cal. The path leads to the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The players are a bald general, a young lieutenant, and a red-robed cardinal. It was President Eisenhower, John Kennedy, the new president, and Cardinal Spellman. Joe Kennedy was a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. John and Robert were not initiated yet. They hadn't yet proved their real loyalty to the Vatican. If they were real loyal to the Vatican, they would have invaded Cuba and given the royalty, the syndicate, the mobs of prostitution, the liquor, the whole gambling syndicate. They would turn it over to Batista, and then the profits would go to Rome. Kennedy denied them those little profits, so they had to build up the Paradise Island and the other islands down in that area. Now, this story says Lumumba was the Castro of Africa. His speeches gave shocks of horrors to the Belgian copper barons. Now, those are the same ITT Anaconda copper barons in Chile. These were the Belgian copper barons. The John McCone of the CIA, who was on the board of ITT, and Richard Helms and Henry Kissinger, said Allende isn't acceptable to the copper barons in the United States at the time of Allende's murder, and the Belgians told the CIA it's not acceptable to have Chambe there because you can't have labor and raise the price of workers in the copper fields and make a profit. So you have to cut the leaders and the idealistic leaders who would take their people out of imperialism and draw them more to a socialism where they can support themselves. In this meeting, the copper barons meet. He says, the titans of U.S. capitalism, the South African mining magnates, who had watched with outrage what Castro had done in Havana. Did Eisenhower, who ordered the CIA to overthrow Guatemala and take out Arbenz in 1954, give the nod to CIA Allen Dulles to get rid of Lumumba at all costs? Of course. And of course, in 1947, the first test was Mosaddegh, kicked out and the Shah of Iran put on. Allen Dulles and Ike gave the go-ahead, get rid of Lumumba. It looks that way, said an intelligence expert told the Village Voice last week. And also the House investigated the assassinations and had fingers on the murder down there. There's quite at length the orders and the desire to kill Chambe. Okay, the complex web gets more tangled. Eisenhower may have nodded, but when he left the White House, Lumumba was still alive. Replacing him was the hyper-charismatic John Kennedy, and in the first weeks of his power, the sinister, charming CIA chief presented him with plans long nourished. You have to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro, and you have to make Mobutu, our client in the Congo, a CIA client, and get rid of Chambe. Now, these were the orders John Kennedy got when he first went into office. Assenting to the invasion of Cuba, Kennedy some say, flinched at the Mobutu plan. Nothing was said, but he knew that he would be signing Lumumba's death warrant. And here the mystery gets deeper. And remember, when John Kennedy was murdered for not going into Cuba and taking orders on killing Castro, Allen Dulles, who ordered him to invade Cuba, had just been fired by John Kennedy shortly before the invasion, because he said, or right after rather, the embarrassment, there's a hidden government behind my back. And he was so distraught by the CIA ordering him on what he had to do that he had fired Allen Dulles. And then Allen Dulles was put on the Warren Commission. He fired him after the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he pulled back. And then Dulles was put on the Warren Commission. And meanwhile, John McCone from the Atomic Energy Commission and Bechtel McCone, and representing then ITT, was the director of the CIA. Now, Cockburn says, here's where the mystery deepens. According to a Newsweek article going back to May 1961, that was 2 years before the Kennedy assassination, in May of 1961, killed just before press time, Cardinal Spellman, in Newsweek they said, and somebody picked up that the story was in the file, the Boneyard, but it wasn't printed, made a dramatic top-secret nighttime visit to the White House to implore Kennedy to back Mobutu, which would be to approve of Lumumba's death. I'll take a break now and turn this tape over because 1/2 hour is over, and I don't want to cut short this article, and then we'll continue with it on side 2 of this tape. This is side 2 of broadcast number 580, part 2. December 17th, 1983. It's Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. I'm continuing with the article that I am sharing with you by Alexander Cockburn, Cockburn. When I'm mad at him, I call him Cockburn. Otherwise, it's really said Cockburn. It's called The Pope, Lumumba, and the Calb Connections, K-A-L-B Connections, printed January the 4th, 1983. He's telling about John Kennedy having a visit by Cardinal Spellman, who went to him in May 1961 when he was just a new president and told him, you have to back Mobutu against Lumumba, and then Lumumba was brutally killed shortly afterwards. On the broadcast that I did in June 1982, I discussed the role of Cardinal Spellman as a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, who was the young priest tutored by the Nicholas Brady family from Dillon Reed and the Morgan Banks, and he was their private priest in their home in Rome, in their little chapel, and then they built him up to become known as Mr. Vietnam, who gave us the entire Vietnam War and the Holocaust that took place there. Everything from genocide to Agent Orange in Southeast Asia has still affected all the lives of those countries that have been decimated and haven't been able to build up. Cardinal Spellman was always behind gung-ho this war, and he's very much a part of the Vatican hierarchy, along with Cardinal Cook in New York, John DeLorean's cardinal. But Spellman went to John Kennedy and pressured him as his priest to back Mobutu. He said that his reason was that Pope John the 23rd favored Lumumba, a relative and humble man, a vicar of Christ, had schooled the young Lumumba and told John 23rd that Lumumba could be won for Rome and lead millions of Africans to the arms of church. And John 23rd was planning his Vatican II Council, a radical conclave, and this pontiff was believing that Lumumba was a sincere kind of person who would divert the Africans towards Rome. But Rome, the Opus Dei that was formed in 1928, or the Masonic Lodge, doesn't want a liberal Catholic Rome. They want a fascist Catholic Rome, so that neither Pope John the 23rd or John Kennedy or Lumumba fit into their scheme of things, and they were murdered by the same people. I believe Pope John the 23rd was killed. He was on in years. The surgery, the operation, the things were questionable when he died. He died in May. Kennedy died in November, and Khrushchev was removed from the government in the Soviet Union. There was three were trying to get a rapprochement, a détente. I don't know how the powers that be got in the Soviet Union got Khrushchev off after removed from office after his buddies were out. But these men were working together, and Cardinal Spellman was determined that Lumumba never enter Rome alive. Now, what kind of a church, I talk about Begin the fascist, and look at Spellman. What business is it of a cardinal in the United States and Boston who's so well off to determine what happens in the Belgian Congo? Once it changes its name, it's still part of the Belgian and the CIA government. And Spellman was determined as he made foreign policy in the White House and in the CIA. This was what he wanted. Now, in Newsweek magazine, there's an item about the author. That's Arnaud de Borchgrave, Arnaud de small d Borchgrave. He's one of the biggest propagandists. He wrote The Spike. He writes anti-Soviet literature. He's one of the biggest propagandists for World War III existing on the planet Earth. And at that time, when Kennedy was young in 1961, and working with Newsweek, de Borchgrave had an informant who was a young journalist in Rome named Claire Sterling. Now, Claire Sterling is the woman that fed Marvin Kalb. I'll tell you some of the punchlines. The information for the NBC program this last year that I called on the air a piece of BS, and so was Claire Sterling. She helped him make a movie on the KGB connections to shooting the Pope for NBC, and she works for Reader's Digest, long supporter of Hitler and Mussolini. That's her cover. She was living in Rome in 1961, and this story of Cockburn says, within days of the secret Spellman visit to Kennedy, Mobutu arrested Lumumba. Within days, hours later, he was delivered. Thugs had done him in. General Mobutu remained the leader of the Belgian Congo and changed the name to Zaire, and that's where the German rocket missiles were put for all of Africa, installed into Zaire. And he doesn't have that in his story, but that is another part of the history that I know of Zaire, the construction of the German missiles to control all black Africa. And Cockburn said he's loyal U.S. ally to this day. He asked the question, did a United States president, John Kennedy, did two U.S. presidents, that's Eisenhower and Kennedy, give the nod to Lumumba's murder? Did the CIA organize his death with the help of Mobutu? Now, he then gets into the story of the Pope. The search for men who engineered the murders leads through a wilderness of mirrors, but one of the investigators of the intriguing Saba has intriguing connections of her own. Madeleine Kalb, the wife of Marvin Kalb, the propagandist for NBC and the Opus Dei. Madeleine Kalb wrote a story. She's Marvin's wife. She wrote a book on Lumumba, the story of his career and summary of her in her book of the life of Patrice Lumumba before he was murdered, called The Congo Papers. And then, he says, by a strange coincidence worthy of the pen of John Le Carre, capital L, small e, capital C-A-R-R-E, or he mentions other mystery writers, Madeleine Kalb's husband, Marvin, years later, becomes the prominent figure in the investigation of the attempted assassination of John Paul II. Is that a coincidence? She's covered up to her ass, I guess I can say it on the air, we'll say it, with the Lumumba story. She is married to a man who is pushing the whole KGB story of the assassination attempt on the Pope. And later I'll give you some interesting comments on what the Soviet Union says in their response. In fact, I might tell you the punchline now. They said in the newspaper last week, if America is looking for conspiracies, why didn't they go into the death of Salvador Allende and Orlando Letelier? Now, Letelier was murdered when George Bush was head of the CIA. Salvador Allende was the same people, the Henry Kissinger crowd that Marvin Kalb works with. And they brought up some questionable murders that should be investigated that I mention every week, so that they're not sitting back and taking it too nicely. They're pointing out that we have some cleaning up ourselves to do. And they mentioned, I'll do more on this, what the Soviet Union is accusing us of doing, of making trouble, and they're asking, why don't you look into these particular murders, which are very pertinent to the story. Now, Cockburn, who usually doesn't jump to conclusions easily or at all, is saying Marilyn is pushing the Lumumba story, which was a CIA plan, and now her husband, years later, is trying to push this other story. Coincidence, he says? It strains all credibility to imagine there is no link between the two Calves and their investigation using Claire Sterling then and now and the Vatican Cardinal Spellman, at that time. He says it strains all credibility. Knowledgeable Vatican insiders suggest the astounding theory that the Calves, Marvin Calv and his wife, who wrote this book on Patrice Lumumba Madeline, are agents of the Opus Dei. And how if you follow this every week, how much I've been talking about the Opus Dei. Insiders say they are both agents, witting or unwitting, of the super-secret Catholic lay order known as Opus Dei, the treacherous group formed in 1928 with a notorious fascist background. He says the Opus Dei originated in Spain, which we said enormously powerful and wealthy. One longtime observer seasoned in international intrigue told the Village Voice, there are only three powers in the world today: the Trilateral Commission, the homosexuals, and the Opus Dei. By homosexuals, he refers to the J. Edgar Hoover, the Clay Shaw, the General Walker, the intrigue, the Henry Kissinger crowd, the John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy, Senator John Tower, the leaders of the world who are swinging and pushing today, who are notorious, not the gay people up in San Francisco on Church Street, but there is a clique of power, whips and chains, the Alfred Bloomingdale sadomasochism, and everything else. The Opus Dei has flagellation. There was a cartoon when the Premier of Pakistan was here, and we criticized him for flogging, and there was some reference to cartoon of sexual flagellation, church flagellation and sexual whipping. How do you separate the three? Whether you agree with it or not, what he's saying in here, there are these powers. This is what Cockburn is saying. These powers today. Opus Dei agents in the Italian Secret Service worked with Mehmet Ali Agca to produce the confession that links him to the Bulgarian Secret Service, the dreaded pawn of the double-dreaded KGB. It's called the Durzhavna, Durzhavna, capital Sigurnost, the dreaded KGB. He says that in the jail, as of August of this year, and this fits in with the story of John Lehman, Princess Grace's cousin, and his brother Joseph Lehman's work inside the Vatican, and their close ties to the Vatican, as had Grace Kelly, who arranged, as I said, her marriage. Now, they're getting information in Europe, and this is what Pravda is saying in his Vestia on how they began to coach Agca into the KGB Bulgarian story because they wanted to frighten the anti-nuclear popes that I talked about last week into shaping up and going along with the Orthodox Church. That the people that want to kill their holy man are linked to the KGB, and this began to be created as a story with the help of Claire Sterling at this time and CIA people working with Agca, like they worked with Lee Harvey Oswald, as I mentioned last week, the parallels, to create a communist story. Isaac Don Levine of the Central Intelligence Agency was working with Marina Oswald after the assassination in one of the declassified documents of the National Archives, and I quoted in the very first article I ever published. He said, we're trying to squeeze a communist story out of this. A white czarist Russian brought to the Dallas-Fort Worth area to work with military people in the defense, and he's trying to squeeze a communist story. That's what makes this story so interesting, are the parallels, their own terminology of what they're going to squeeze out of her. In return, she gets about 10 acres and a refrigerator and a room of her own and certain comforts she'd never get in the Soviet Union, so she pawns it all. The guy's gone anyway, and she trades it for the security that she has. Now back to the Cockburn article. He claims in the Village Voice that the Secret Service, the Italian Secret Service, that's the same Secret Service that was exposed in the Masonic Lodge scandal that had 30,000 files on people that works in a plan to overthrow Italy for fascism, has been working with Agca to produce these confessions about the KGB, headed at that time by Yuri Andropov. Now, this kind of propaganda will only work if it has an ounce of truth. If it has no truth, it makes fools of us. So Richard Pipes can talk about the KGB confessions. I'm going to go into that. The Henry Kissinger, the Israeli government, even Menachem Begin, they're pushing a KGB story out of nothing and nowhere, just as they pushed Oswald-Fidel Castro relationship that it'll be 20 years since Kennedy was murdered and there isn't a thread of evidence. But the same people working through the same era, not different people in different places. Now he says when the word was filtered from the CIA and the Italian Secret Service to Agca, then it went to Claire Sterling and to Marvin Kalb, who became the NBC spokesman for the KGB tried to shoot the Pope. Why? Asked Alexander Cockburn. The intelligence sources suggest the following from his information, and I talked to him, as I say, on the phone last week and asked him if he worked on this story a long time. How could he take a month ago he's putting me down with Grace and the Vatican connections. How did he get so smart in 1 month? But I think even people like that catch on eventually. If they're honest, they can't fail to see that some of these things are connected, and he certainly makes them here. He says intelligence sources suggest the following. The Opus Dei regarded John Paul II as a possible deadly enemy, and that's one of the motives I have here, that he wasn't right enough. The pious Pole denounced the Spanish Inquisition, which he did, and last week I had his denouncement of the Nobel Nazi sperm bank in San Diego, and the appointment of Bernardine as a cardinal. Speaking out against atomic weapons himself. That's why I put those things so carefully in the broadcast last week. For those of you who don't have that broadcast, it's part of this one. There's a continuity. I put them there because this was happening all the last few weeks and last few months. The United States was severing from the Vatican politically. Now, the reasoning and logic behind the intelligence report is, he says the Opus Dei is regarded as a deadly enemy. Now, when he wrote this, simultaneously, John Paul II elevated the Opus Dei. But I think the reason he elevated them, there's a blackmail squeeze that he doesn't account for in this story, was that the Vatican will not tell where their $1.4 billion is in the Panama banks alone and in the Bahamas banks, and the disgrace of having those debts tied to the Gambinos and the Genoveses and the organized crime families in Milan, and particularly this new drug bust in Milan. The embarrassment of being linked to the mafia all these years, the Vatican, is more embarrassing to the Pope than elevating the Opus Dei, because they will assume his loans and cover up the debts of the mafia people and narcotics traffic interwoven with the Vatican. Now, there's a contradiction here where Cockburn says the Opus Dei didn't like the Pope, but on the other hand, the Pope has elevated them, and it may be that he doesn't have any choice. They may have a fight with each other, but they don't have any choice. He claims that the Opus Dei didn't like the Pope's remarks about the Inquisition. Now, according to Cockburn in the Village Voice, Agca was the first tool of the conspiracy, just as Lee Harvey Oswald was selected when he was in Navy intelligence. False trails were led through the capitals of Europe, and that's why I mentioned last week the false tales of Oswald with Castro Cubans allegedly in Texas, and calling on Sylvia Odio and going to the Cuban embassy in Mexico. They didn't bother too much in other places, but there were false trails of Oswald to a car agency where he's going to drive a car away, to a rifle range. They left false trails of his behavior as an alleged would-be assassin in a furniture store and in the barber shop and in the Cuban embassies. And they left false trails in the capitals of Europe. That bid fell and didn't work, but there was another bid. A young priest, the disciple of the Pope's deadliest foes, lunged at him with a bayonet. Now, what he's saying is Agca was selected. He was the first tool, and he failed. Then you remember when the priest lunged at the Pope in Spain when he was there at the statue of the Fatima, the miracle of Fatima. He said, I work for the Opus Dei. He said, I work for the far right-wing group, that the Pope is too left. They caught him in the second assassination place on the anniversary of the miracle of Fatima, the famous virgin who appeared to Portuguese children, warning the world of a dreadful event. Now, the mystery of Fatima started in 1917, and even Mr. Cockburn gets analytical here more than I've ever seen in a single article of his or in any for a long time, that parallels the way I try to do an hour on my radio programs. He says the Catholics knew well that the event was the Russian Revolution in 1917, and the Fatima miracle is a peculiarly sacred day for all anti-communist calendars. To find a Pope's assailant, the true assailant, he says, you have to go to the west to the Iberian Peninsula, the home of Zubaran, Zubaran, and the mystic trinity of orange, lemon, and rose. The intrigue does not stop there, and he's talking about the attempt on the Pope by the far right a second time. That didn't succeed. They tried it once, it didn't work. They tried it a second time, it didn't work. But then he said you have to go to the Blackfriars Bridge, arching over the Thames River in London. And he gets into that. Suspended beneath it on one wintry day, it wasn't winter, it was June 18th, he makes it dramatic, was Signor Roberto Calvi, the head of the Banco Ambrosiano. The Banco was the mechanism whereby the Vatican's ruthless financial controllers, headed by powerful papal bodyguard and financial manipulator, U.S.-born Marcinkus, the man that didn't make cardinal last week, they were funneling the church's riches to the safety of the New World. Now, they were funding the anti-Castro Cubans. They were funding Joseph Mengele in Paraguay. They were funding the exojets that were fighting the British in the Falklands War simultaneously. All the scandal was going on. They were funding fascism in the United States for Nazi organizations in the United States and funding a lot of operations. And he refers to the hanging at the bridge and the links to the money. Now, Roberto Calvi knew too much. Thus, he died abruptly at the end of the rope, and a month ago his wife denounced the Vatican as the organizer of his death. Now, I've read on the programs earlier the claims of his son, who lives in Washington, that his father was murdered by the Opus Dei. The wife saying he was murdered by the Opus Dei by the tangles of the Vatican finances. Now, if Grace Kelly came back to the Prince of Monaco, having the marriage arranged by a priest in Virginia, and goes up to Pennsylvania and takes him there one Christmas night, and they have dinner, and he says, right then, will you marry me? And she says, and her family says it was an arrangement. He has his own mistresses. She's been close to the Vatican. And at a time when the mob is tangled and losing its money because Calvi is dangling off that bridge, and he's tied up the European banks, the Monaco banks, and Grace is in the Vatican at this time when other witnesses are being killed, as I say. It was unfair of him to laugh off the fact that he doesn't have to read further about Grace's links to the Vatican, but thank goodness a month later in the Village Voice he's talking about the Opus Dei. He says the cardinals met in Rome last fall to review the Ambrosiano disaster, and the Pope made a significant gesture. Intriguing. He made the head of the Opus Dei a bishop. Oh yeah, I forgot that he did elevate him, even though this scandal was going on and they claim he hates the Opus Dei, but he doesn't explain that contradiction. Was this a subtle sign for the Polish pontiff that he had seen through a false flag recruitment, the bogus trail to Sofia and Moscow? Did the Polish pontiff, he asked, see this false story of the KGB a few weeks ago, starting in October and November, with Mr. Richard Pipes and Henry Kissinger and the Italian Nazi clink? Did that Pope see through the false flag recruitment, the bogus trail from Sofia in Bulgaria and Moscow, and correctly turned his eyes to the Iberian Peninsula, to the area where the mystic trinity of orange, lemon, and rose, the Fatima story? Or was it an indication of surrender? Did he get smart and say to the Opus Dei, I'll let you cover my mafia debts and hidden bank accounts and the money that we used to fight the British? Did he do it cynically elevated, or was he surrendering? Will the Pope be drawn, will the papal favor be withdrawn from Spain's experiment in democracy? Will they try to overthrow it like they did in February and March? Remember, in 1981, there was an attempted coup of the fascists in Spain. In March, Ronald Reagan was shot, and there was an attempted coup in the United States by the Opus Dei, that is Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger crowd. And then he eased those people out of office, as I read you the list last week of some of the people that changed. And then the Pope was shot in May. That was a year of assassination attempts and coups that I chronicled very carefully each week on the air and detailed their importance. And he is saying, will the Spanish government now be overthrown and we put a Franco-type government back? Will Spain's experiment in democracy under this courageous tutelage now will it be put back in the hands of the fascists? We have to see. Then Cockburn concludes the article, behind the Opus Dei faction, which he has identified Claire Sterling and Marvin Kalb. Behind the Opus Dei faction, the manipulators behind the Banco Ambrosiano does lead a trail back once again to Langley, Virginia, where they sat and planned the Lumumba operation, with the historian of that, of course, being Marvin Kalb's wife, Madeleine Kalb. Do we go back again from Lumumba and John Kennedy to the assassination attempt on the Pope to Langley, to a faction in the Reagan administration desperate to discredit Andropov and the hopes for an arms treaty that exists? Early this week, the Vatican announced an investigation into Ambrosiano affair with 3 Vatican and 3 Italian representatives. The plot against the Pope, as with the plot against Lumumba, is not a detective story with tidy endings. And let me interject into here the plot against John Kennedy. Lumumba was murdered, and John Kennedy was murdered by the same people that killed Lumumba. He's left that out. Maybe that's why he doesn't like me. I'll discuss it when I see him sometime. Kennedy fit right into the same time slot and was killed by the same people. He says the plot against the Pope, as with the plot against Lumumba, is not a detective story with a tidy ending. It is a cautionary tale about the perils of an increasingly dangerous world. Now, last week, an official council counseled the Village Voice. They said first it was Madeleine Kalb with Lumumba, and with Cardinal Spelling, and with Claire Sterling, and Alan Dulles. Then Marvin Kalb with Claire Sterling and the CIA and Langley, Virginia. I'd watch out for what Bernard says. That may be the key. Now, Bernard, we'll go into Bernard Kalb, because if they're all Opus Dei, who are they? And then, of course, we get to my favorite subject, which is Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer, and the story of how Henry Kissinger, the Nazi, came to this country under the tutelage of Fritz Kramer, who touted Henry Kissinger the most. Many of you have the paperback or the hardback book. It's called Kissinger, just plain Kissinger, published in 1974. Photographs. It was written by Bernard Kalb and Marvin Kalb. Now, once you know that they're Opus Dei with propaganda of covering up murders, you can take an overlay of what they did in the past, and I've saved every newspaper article about these events since 1963, and some going back earlier, but since 1963, to pinpoint those people that have lied to you about Lee Harvey Oswald, Oswald's connections. They're the same network that lie about the Lumumba murder or Trujillo murder or Diem murder, you name it. I mean, if you want 100 murders, Mosaddegh, we can go down the list, the assassinations that they've done. Now, on the cover of the book, they describe Bernard Kalb and Marvin Kalb. Those are the 2 men that have traveled and taunted Henry Kissinger, the protege of this Fritz Kramer from I.G. Farben in Nazi Germany, who came to U.S. Army intelligence. Kissinger was the protege of Kramer, and then as he catapulted to his famous positions, the Cowboys, wouldn't it be righteous? Isn't it wonderful that the Opus Dei carries him, up on their shoulders as the pinnacle of the statesman? Wouldn't it have to come from the Kalb brothers? Now, the description of them on the book that I never took too seriously before they starting these massive lies. Marvin Kalb has dug into Kissinger, the Kalb brothers, into his past to trace his early history, his emergence as a superstar, the whirlwind Henry of Arabia, the Mideast talks, the bombing of Hanoi, Kissinger's tilting towards Pakistan in the Indian-Pakistan War, the international domestic repercussions of Watergate, the second most powerful man in the world, the Jew who kissed Egyptian president on both cheeks and called him brother. Brother was Anwar Sadat. Sadat was put in by the Nazi Bormann Brotherhood. Otto Skorzeny took his top Nazis to Nasser and Sadat to train them how to control the world and make it safe for Nazis. On the fly of the book, the Kalb brothers are described as praising the Jew who kissed the Egyptian president, called him brother. Marvin Kalb has been diplomatic correspondent to CBS News since 1963. That's when Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig and Fritz Kramer had a role in the ordering the murder of John Kennedy. He's covered Kissinger since he came to Washington in 1969, and when he became Secretary of State, he followed him on every overseas mission. No wonder Kissinger, the hero, Kissinger the Great. The Moscow Summit, China, and so forth. Kalb joined CBS in 1957. That was the year of the Appalachian mob meeting to divide the world year that Howard Hughes was kidnapped. A very important year, 1957. He had been in the State Department. Brother Bernard, that Cockburn warns us about. Brother Bernard is a journalist, foreign correspondent. The New York Times was CBS. He joined them in 1962, the year before John Kennedy was murdered. So CBS and NBC had both groups covered for Cardinal Spellman, for the Vatican, for Reinhard Galen, who was a Knight of Malta, for James Angleton, who was a Knight of Malta, for William Casey. The CIA had their Vatican bonds. They got rid of John Kennedy. The Kalb brothers are now identified in this ball of wax. Isn't it righteous? It's exactly, you couldn't write a script better than this one. In 1991, Bernard Kalb, after 15 years with the Times, the last 5 years based in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, he went on to the Council of Foreign Relations. Can you believe that? 1961, spending 15 years before in Southeast Asia, when Mr. Donovan of the OSS was getting the French out of Southeast Asia so the dope would come into the United States through Nugan Handbank. I'm running out of time again on this tape. Next week we'll go into the propaganda story on the attempted assassination of the Pope and the role of the Kalb brothers. You can see why it's so difficult to get information into NBC and CBS, the news kings who are walking and traveling with the Henry Kissingers, the protégés of the Fritz Kramers. There's a lot more I want to say on this subject, but we'll have to continue next week. The time is up, and I'm sorry. This is Mae Brussell, a KAZU FM, and we'll continue some more on this within 1 week.